Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh the facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and pony owner. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing easy keepers on multiple acres of pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and like all good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We talk about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
With that, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the following episode. There's one thing that we probably bring up more often than anything else here on the Scoop and Scale podcast, and that is ration balancers. Claire seems to be a big fan, and I know we both feed a ration balancer to our personal horses. Although they come up frequently, we haven't done an episode on ration balancers it's been a while. I think it's probably been 2 years, which is sort of crazy that we've even been doing this for 2 years. Yeah. So I thought that today we could take a look at why we like them so much and see if we can dispel a few of the common myths that exist around them.
Sounds good to me.
Let's jump right in and start off with, what is a ration balancer?
So typically, a ration balancer is a highly fortified pellet feed that's designed to provide what is not typically in your forage-based diet. So they tend to have high crude protein. You're often going to see a crude protein of around 30%. And they provide sources of what we call pre-secally digestible protein, meaning that the protein that's in there is going to be easily digestible and available for absorption in the small intestine, which is kind of, that's the only place we can absorb protein and amino acids in the digestive tract. And it's worth noting that not all the protein in forage is going to be available in the small intestine, because it could be all bound up in structural fiber and require microbial fermentation first. And that, of course, doesn't happen until after the small intestine. So the trick is when you have a hay analysis on your hay, it might come back with a really nice crude protein of like 12%. But that doesn't mean to say that just because it was there on the benchtop in the lab, it doesn't mean to say that it's actually available to your horse in their digestive tract, because if it isn't liberated until the hindgut, you've missed a site of digestion and absorption in the small intestine. So it's not going to be as useful to your horse. So the nice thing about most ration balancers have, that high protein, that 30%, and most of that's coming from soy most commonly, and that's very easily digestible and is going to be available in the small intestine. So those ration balancers really give your horse a source of quality protein, which is a nice insurance policy on top of your forage protein. And then ration balancers provide high concentrations of trace minerals like copper and zinc that also tend to be missing in a lot of our forages, or at too lower levels to meet your horse's requirement. And they also provide good amounts of macro minerals. So your macro minerals are things like calcium, magnesium, phosphorus. And this is important because for horses that are solely eating grass or grass hay, calcium content may be low. It's not always, but it is sometimes, right? And I've definitely seen plenty of hay analyses where the calcium is equal to or lower than the phosphorus. And when this happens, you can end up with issues with bone health. So I've actually worked on a number of horses that had weird shifting lameness issues, and then ended up coming back to the fact that the hay they were on had, like a 1-to-1 calcium phosphorus ratio, when really we would like the total ration to have a calcium phosphorus ratio of like 1.5 to 2 times more calcium than phosphorus. So again, that ration balancer is designed to kind of help create that ideal ratio. And, so it's really a source of your, trace minerals, like quality protein. It helps improve the relative ratios of certain minerals to each other to help, ensure absorption. And so, yeah, that's kind of what a ration balancer is in a nutshell.
And they typically provide all the nutrients that we know horses have a requirement for based on the NRC,
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And yeah, for sure. And the NRC is, for the listeners that don't know, that's an abbreviation for the National Research Council. And they publish those nutrient requirements for horses, although they haven't done it since 2007. As a hotly debated topic of conversation amongst us as to whether or not there'll ever be another one, an updated version. But typically, the ration balance have all the main trace and macro minerals, including selenium, as well as the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, and E. And then sometimes they'll have the water-soluble vitamins in there as well, like thiamine. However, not all manufacturers guarantee the levels of all these nutrients. So it's not uncommon, for example, to see copper and zinc guaranteed, but you won't necessarily see manganese, right? So what generally gets guaranteed is going to vary by state regulation, because each state regulates what should be on the feed tag. And then it'll also come down to manufacturer preference beyond the regulation. They have to do the minimum of the regulation for the state where that feed is sold, but they could choose to do more. But generally, they're going to guarantee that, the minimum of protein, fat, fiber, calcium, phosphorus, copper, zinc, selenium, and vitamin A, because that's what's suggested by the American Association of Feed Control Officials as being the minimum that should be on a horse feed tag.
I see on the forums daily people stating their horses are on pasture or round bale. They're feeding a hay pellet and some supplements and are asking what else does their horse need?
Yeah, this is exactly the purpose of a ration balancer, right? So those horses, they need a ration balancer. Just as I mentioned a moment ago, they give your horse the main things that are missing in that forage-based diet in one easy package, right? So they balance that diet, hence why they're called ration balancers, right? Because they balance the diet.
Balancers are not feeds that you feed because you want more calories.
Right. They're a pretty low calorie feed to start with. And because they're highly fortified, their serving size for a typical horse is quite small. I mean, typically, the manufacturers are going to recommend that you only feed 1 or 2 pounds, or maybe even less, so less than a kilo for an average size horse. So they won't be a major source of calories in the ration anyway, just because you're not feeding very much of them, right? Even if they were super high in calories, you're not feeding very much, but they aren't. They're low in calories and you don't feed very much. So basically, if your horse can maintain their weight at a desirable level just eating forage, then you don't really need a high calorie performance feed, right? Like they're already, if you did, they would become overweight, right? So what you need in that instance is a feed that's just going to give you what's typically missing in that forage-based diet. And that's what a ration balancer provides. So it's not, you don't feed it because you want more calories. And I've certainly run into people who have started off feeding, the 1 or 2 pounds of ration balancer, and then their horses have started to lose weight. And so they've increased the amount of balancer. I've had people, who suddenly are feeding like 4 pounds of balancer. And I'm like, no. Like that is not, it's not
That's
designed
not
to
how
be
it
fed.
works.
Like, no, it's so fortified. That would be like taking, I don't know, what can I think of quickly? Like a 1-a-day women's, multivitamin or something, and taking 4 of them a day.
Doesn't
right?
work that way.
It's just not how it works, right? So it's not, if you want extra calories, if you're feeding a ration balancer and your horse starts losing weight, the solution is not to feed more ration balancer. You need a different solution, right? Like they're not meant as a calorie source.
So is a ration balancer actually a supplement then? Like from what you've said, I think some listeners might say that what you described sounds like a supplement.
I mean, I think in some ways they are a supplement. I mean, if you look at the definition, definition of a supplement is something that completes something, right? Or makes an addition to something. So if you use that definition, then yeah, a ration balance is a supplement. But I think in the equine space, when we think supplement, we're thinking more typically about something with an even smaller serving size, right? So I don't refer to them as a supplement, although if you're being super picky, they do meet the definition of a supplement, but I don't think of them that way because they are, a pound or 2 a day is a larger serving size than we typically would think of when we think supplements in the equine space.
Aren't there actually ration balancing supplements out there that have those really small serving sizes?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Trying to be okay. Yeah, so there are products out there. I refer to those as ration balancing supplements. So when I say ration balancer, I'm meaning a ration balancing feed. If you're not wrong, right? There are supplements out there with an even smaller serving size, like maybe like 4 ounces, that kind of do the same thing. And I refer to those as ration balancing supplements to have a clearly delineated difference between the two.
Listen, I just want to make sure that this unicorn that we call a ration balancer is understood by everybody. That's all.
That's fair. I'm
talking about
trying
all
to
the
be
options.
difficult.
Yep. How do these differ from the balancing feeds?
So generally, the ration balancing supplements are not going to provide such high levels of the macrominerals like calcium and phosphorus and magnesium if they provide them at all, right? So these minerals have a daily requirement of gram amounts for your horse. And you have to remember that not all 100% of the sources used in these products are actually that mineral. So, you won't fit it all in there.
What do you mean?
Like, what do I mean about that 100% of the source is not going to be the mineral?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say you're using calcium carbonate as your calcium source, right?
Okay.
Because there's no like pure calcium, right? Calcium is part of something else, like calcium carbonate, like calcium, anyway, there's all sorts of different sources of calcium, right? But let's just pretend we need 20 grams of calcium in this product per serving, and we're going to use calcium carbonate as our source of calcium, right? So calcium carbonate's not 100% calcium, right? Because it's carbonate as well. So you have to account for the carbonate. So typically, about 40% of calcium carbonate, just under 40%, is calcium. So if I want 20 grams of calcium per serving, I'm going to need to put in 50 grams of calcium carbonate to get those 20 grams of calcium, right? So if the serving size of that product, for one of these supplements, is 4 ounces a day, and 4 ounces is like 113.5 grams roughly, right? And so if 50 grams of that is going to be calcium, almost 50% of my product is now made up with my calcium source, and I haven't even added anything else yet, right? So there just isn't room in that 4 ounce serving for large inclusion nutrients, right? And all the macrominerals are like that. So at the same time, the same thing's true for protein, right? Horses need gram quantities of the various amino acids and protein. And because there's not a lot of room for like a complete protein in there that supplies all the amino acids, the ration balancing supplements typically add pure amino acids in gram amounts, instead of having like a complete protein that like soybean meal, which provides all the amino acids, right? So you often only see lysine, methionine, and threonine being guaranteed on those ration balancing supplements because they're added individually. And because those 3 are thought to be the most commonly missing amino acids. So you generally get those, but you're not going to get the full spectrum of amino acids. And the benefit of the ration balancing feeds is that because there's more space, because you've got like 1 or 2 pounds, you can make sure you're actually including the full spectrum of amino acids a horse needs, not just 2 or 3. And you can put in all that calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus, those gram quantity macrominerals as well. So that's the biggest difference in my mind between the ration balancing supplements and the ration balancing feeds.
So do you ever recommend feeding these ration balancing supplements?
I do, but like nowhere near as much as I recommend the ration balancing feeds.
So when do you find yourself using the supplement?
I'll use them like if I have a really easy keeper, right? Like where I'm really struggling with weight management and I'm really trying to control the calories very closely. And I don't have signs of needing things like higher levels of protein. So for me, like if it's got a good top line, which let's be honest, most overweight horses, and they're often not lacking, it may not be real top line in inverted commas, right? But they're not lacking top line. Often they're super crusty and fat. They might not have any muscle, but they've got good feet. They've got a healthy coat. Look, they look generally healthy. then I'm like, okay, maybe I can get away without, having a complete protein source in there. And in that moment, I'm more worried about their calorie intake, and I'm trying to really cut calories at the same time. That allows me then to feed sort of like as much forage as I can. So then I'll use the ration balancing supplements. Often when people are they're adding them to something like a hay pellet though, right? So if you go on the forums and stuff, you'll see people, they're feeding a pound of Timothy pellets and a 4-ounce ration balancing supplement to give their horse something to eat the ration balancing supplement with, especially as some of these are powders and not super palatable. So I think at that point, if you're feeding a pound of Timothy pellets to get your horse to eat the ration balancing supplement, you might as well feed the ration balancing feed at 1 pound, right? And have the complete protein source and all the macro minerals. So I tend to gravitate towards the feeds personally.
When I was in Pony Club, we learned about forages and concentrates. And
me too.
Yep. And a concentrate was a feed that provided a concentrated amount of a certain nutrient. So are ration balancers concentrates?
Technically, yeah. I mean, they're super concentrated, right? So and most well-formulated ration balancing feeds are going to be concentrates because they're providing a concentrated source of something like protein, right? So at 30% protein, that's a way higher concentration of protein than most of your typical other feed ingredients that you might sort of come across feeding horses. If we think back to way back when, grass hays is sort of in that 10 to 12% protein, oats, barley, wheat, none of them have super high protein levels. So at 30% protein, that is a lot more protein than most of the feed. So it would be considered a concentrated source of protein, right? A protein concentrate. Similarly, because they're, have a lot of, high concentration of minerals in them, they're also kind of a mineral concentrate as well. But I do think that the word concentrate, when we started using it in relation to equine feeds, it was aimed more at the high calorie feeds, right? The energy concentrates. So when I think concentrate, I tend to think of things like oats or the performance type feeds rather than a ration balancer. And so while ration balancers are concentrates, I worry about using the term concentrate in relation to ration balancers because I think there's still a number of, good horse people out there who might then think that a ration balancer is high in calories or consider it to be then grain because that's the more sort of historical use of the term concentrate tends to be in relation to energy and like grains.
When I think of concentrate, the first thing I think of is sweet feed.
Exactly. Right. So I don't refer to ration balances as concentrate because then I immediately think people are going to think it's grain.
Right. Yeah. Well, I definitely see people on the Forage First group saying they want to stop feeding their horses grain. And when they share that they're currently feeding, like when they're sharing their current diet, it's hay and a ration balancer. So is a ration balancer grain?
No, not in my mind. And I think I always interpret those posts, right? When people post that, it's like they're wanting to get rid of their ration balancer because they think their ration balance is grain and they're wanting to go grain free in air quotes.
Yeah.
And so my assumption is that they think that the ration balancer is grain. And again, my interpretation of the word grain is that it relates to like high starch cereals, right? Like barley, corn, and oats and wheat. Like those are grains. Like they are actually grains.
By definition.
By definition, right? And now people have horse people have a negative connotation towards those grains because we've become so anti-starch. And so now we mention the word grain and it's like a dirty word because it just automatically is associated with starch and starch being bad. And that's a whole different subject, which I think we've touched on in multiple podcasts, but like it's not appropriate for some horses, but it's just fine for others, right? So when you hear the word grain, they think high starch, but we seem to have morphed into using the term grain for anything that's a pellet and that gets put in a bucket, right? So I've had clients tell me that their horses get alfalfa pellets for their grain.
Right.
Right. And I'm like, that's not a grain, that's chopped up hay. Right? But because it's in a pellet, it's grain in inverted commas, right? So while a lot of ration balances do have wheat middlings in them, right, because they make a good pellet and they're palatable, they're not grain. Just because it's a pellet, it's not grain.
And details matter. We say that all the
They
time.
do.
The details matter.
They do. Words and details matter. Right. So yes, I don't refer to ration balances as grain, although many people do. And when people tell me their horse is grain in the ration balance, I get what they're saying. I realize they fall into the category of it's a pellet, it's in a bucket, therefore it's grain.
Right. So if they aren't grain and they aren't fed for calories, does that make them safe for horses with metabolic issues?
You would think so, wouldn't you? But as is always the case, it's, buyer beware, and you can't assume that to be the case, right? So while there are a lot of really good low non-structural carbohydrate ration balances on the market, there are some that are higher that I would not ever use for the population of horses that have a metabolic. So just last week, actually, I came across one from a European manufacturer that's available in the US, and it advertises on the website, on their product page, it says that it's low in sugar, no added molasses, and ideal for metabolic and laminitic horses. And I was like, great, this is super. While the horse I was working with was not diagnosed metabolic or laminitic, it was certainly a breed predisposed to having those problems. And so then I kept going down the website and went to their guaranteed analysis table and found that the non-structural carbohydrate content was close to 40% because it had, what was it, like 39 point something percent starch. So completely not appropriate for horses that are metabolic or laminitic. So, and again, had the word balancer in the title. So you can't assume that it's going to be safe. And there are some balances made by domestic manufacturers in the US that are also higher in non-structural carbohydrate than I would like to see for that population of horses. So while balancers are a great category for that group of horses as a starting point for owners to look at because of the small serving size, and those horses typically don't need a lot of extra calories and do well just being maintained on forage-based diets, you cannot assume that just because it has the word balancer in the title that it is going to be safe for a metabolic horse. And I think it's worth mentioning that the soy-free balancers often have higher non-structural carbohydrates than the more traditional soy-based one. And that's because they're not using soy as their protein source, right? They're having to use alternative protein sources like pea protein, and peas are higher in starch. So typically, if you're going soy-free, you're getting more non-structural carbohydrate. Although I've not seen one as high as the one I just mentioned that was from the European manufacturer.
And just for newer horse owners or people that aren't familiar with reading the tags, like you said, we were talking about two different things there, but they are the same thing. The NSC was close to 40% because it had high starch, and starch is
part of the NSC,
right?
Yeah. Well, no, it's not sugar.
I know,
but
you can explain that.
No, but you raise a really good point though, because that was what the marketing was getting at, right?
Yes.
So the marketing was like, this is low sugar. We haven't added any molasses, so therefore it's safe for these metabolic horses that have a sort of an extreme insulin response to higher starch and sugar feeds. And yeah, they completely ignored starch, right? And I think as horse owners, we're very interested in sugar because most of our cold season grasses, like our timothies, our orchards, they tend to become unsafe because of their sugar content, not because of their starch content. So that tends to be the conversation we're having around these horses, is getting them low sugar forages. And so we're thinking about sugar, and let's think about the human diet. We keep being told how bad refined sugar is for us, right? So I think sugar is like, it's like on the brain, like it's all over human nutrition. It's what we tend to talk about in equine nutrition for these horses because of forages typically being, it's a sugar thing in forages, but starch is also really important. And, when you add your sugar and starch together, that's how you come up with non-structural carbohydrates. So the combination of both is what we're really interested in. And so this manufacturer had just completely ignored the starch component of their diet. And, we really want the non-structural carbohydrate, the starch and sugar added together to be, below 12, probably even below 10% for some of these horses, right? So a 39% starch is definitely not appropriate.
Right. But surely in the scheme of the entire diet, it makes very little difference whether a feed is 10% NSC or 20% NSC if you're only feeding a really small amount? Like we're saying, it's a one pound.
Right. Yep.
So true, false?
Yeah, it's true. For most horses, that would be true, right? But for highly sensitive individuals, even the small amount of non-structural carbohydrate difference between those two would be too much, right? So it's been suggested that for, non-structural carbohydrate intake per meal should be kept below a threshold of 0.1 grams per kilogram body weight for these sensitive individuals. All right, so let's say you have your 1,100 pound horse or your 500 kilo horse. This would mean that you should not feed more than 50 grams of non-structural carbohydrate per meal. So what does that actually look like in your example of like a 10% or 20% NSC feed? Well, it means that you could feed 500 grams of a 10% balancer, or just over a pound, right? Because a pound's 454 grams. So you can feed your pound of balancer, right? The 10% balancer to that horse, but only half a pound in that meal if it's a 20% NSC balancer. So it can make a difference.
So this one comes up a lot. We see this a lot. So wasn't there some research that led to concerns about feeding high protein to these metabolically sensitive horses?
There was, yes, and it caused a whole brouhaha.
It still causes we see it all the time when people are talking about ration balancers. I can't feed it. It's got 30% protein. They're too high.
Right. And so what happened was they fed these insulin dysregulated horses meals that were high in protein. So they used 6 mature horses diagnosed with equine metabolic syndrome and 6 age matched control horses that didn't have equine metabolic syndrome. And the horses were fed 2 grams per kilogram body weight of a high protein pellet. So that pellet had a 31% crude protein. So very typical of a ration balancer. And they fed 2 grams per kilogram body mass at time 0. And then for some reason, they fed it again 30 minutes later, which I don't quite understand why they did that, because it's just like completely not
real world.
No, right? I don't feed it 8 a.m. and then go running back out at 8:30 and feed again. So anyway, but that's what they did in this study. So they ended up, ultimately, that resulted in, a total of 4 grams per kilogram body weight. And that was following an overnight fast. So the horses had been fasted overnight. They hadn't had any hay, and they came out first thing in the morning, and at time 0, they gave them this 2 gram per kilogram body weight of this high protein pellet. And then 30 minutes later, they gave them the same amount again. And then they collected blood samples, sort of over a 4-hour period, and they analyzed them for glucose, insulin, amino acids, all kinds of things, right? And the glucose concentrations were not different between the metabolic horses and the normal horses, but the horses with equine metabolic syndrome had a 9-fold greater insulinic response to the consumption of a high protein meal compared to the horses that were not equine metabolics, didn't have equine metabolic syndrome, so that's a big difference.
Yeah, so based on that, it was a concern.
It was a concern, absolutely. But as is always the case with research and with all things, the devil is in the details, right? So the balancer that they used, you would not consider to be a low NSC balancer. So they not only did they feed high protein, they also fed a higher than generally recommended amount of NSC, and they fed 4 pounds a day, as I mentioned before, that it basically in one meal, which I can't think of one ration balancer on the market that would recommend an intake of 4 pounds per day, let alone in one meal, of their high protein ration balancer. I can think of one where they say you can go up to maybe 3.3 pounds, but it's just not a typical how people feed a ration balancer, right? And so then the issue was not so much the protein, it was the non-structural carbohydrate. And this was confirmed by a subsequent study that was done, some of the same researchers actually in both these studies. And so the subsequent study was done in 2021. And so in that study, they looked at the impacts of varying non-structural carbohydrate and protein, right? So they fed a range of different diets. They had a 74% non-structural carbohydrate with a 9% crude protein. And then they had a ration balancer with low protein. So that one had a 17% crude protein, 15% NSC. Then they fed a regular ration balancer, high protein, so a 37% crude protein, 14% NSC. And they looked at the, results of that, and they found that It was the NSC that appeared to be the main driver of the post-meal insulin response, not the high protein, right? So the insulin dysregulated horses did respond disproportionately to feeding even lower, moderately higher amounts of NSC than the control, the regular non-metabolic horses. But it wasn't related to crude protein that was in that meal at all. So unfortunately, we created a little bit of an unnecessary drama around feeding metabolic horses high protein.
Yeah, it always amazes me how often that comes up about the protein and the balancers.
And there's so many myths around high protein, right? So
people seem to get quite worried about the level of protein, even if they don't have a horse with a metabolic issue. And I assume because of that myth that protein makes horses hot. Like, isn't that why people...
I do think that, yeah. That can be the other one, right? Like if your horse isn't metabolic, then you don't want to feed high protein because it's going to make your horse crazy.
Right. But the amount of protein being consumed from a balancer when fed a pound or two isn't that great in the context of the entire diet. Isn't that right?
That's true. And I always, when I think about this, I think back to a rather heated, awkward conversation I had with a veterinarian who was treating a client of mine's horse. And unfortunately, the horse had kidney damage as a result of some non-steroidal inflammatory drug usage and needed to be on a low protein diet because obviously your kidneys have to, you break down any protein beyond what your horse requires gets broken down into, all the amino acids and they get excreted and those as ammonia in urea. So your kidneys are responsible for a lot of that. And so you don't want to feed excess levels of protein to horses that have kidney issues. And so I had the horse on 1.5 pounds of a 30% ration balancer. And this is while the horse was in ICU and we was working with the vet at the ICU, and we put the horse on this balancer. It was doing fine. It was recovering, doing well. And then the horse came home, and it was their regular field veterinarian who was very concerned about the fact that this horse was on a 30% ration balancer and recovering from kidney failure. And so they reached out saying that they wanted to put the horse on a 14% protein senior feed because it had lower protein. Totally get it. It was only 14% protein instead of 30. However, for that senior feed to be able to provide, the level of other nutrient fortification that the horse required, you were going to have to feed the minimum daily intake that was recommended for that, which was 6 pounds a day. And at 6 pounds and 14% crude protein, that would have resulted in the horse consuming 381 grams of protein versus the 1.5 pounds of balancer that I had recommended at 30% protein only provided 204 grams of protein. So even though what I had recommended was, twice as much protein, it actually resulted in significantly less protein coming into the diet. So the vet was not having it and was stuck on the higher protein percentage. And it took some convincing that the diet I had the horse on was actually providing less protein.
There are some lower protein balancers on the market. What's the thinking there?
To my knowledge, and I'm sure if I'm wrong, someone will reach out and correct me, but the lower protein balancers were created in response to a lot of horse owners feeding high amounts of alfalfa. So that's pretty common in the Western states because alfalfa traditionally has been cheaper to grow than grass hay. And so people will feed, here in Arizona, you get lots of places where they just feed straight alfalfa. And so obviously those horses are getting a ton of protein already, and they're getting a much higher calcium than phosphorus ratio because there's a lot more calcium as well in alfalfa. And so some of the manufacturers decided to come out with balancers that were lower in protein and actually didn't have very much added calcium in order to kind of help specifically with the alfalfa thing. And you'll sometimes see those. I can think of a couple of manufacturers that have like an alfalfa balancer, and those tend to be lower in protein as well, tend to be lower in protein. So I think that's why they're lower in protein. Personally, I've never done much with them because I find that the better quality protein that you get in the higher soy-based balances, as I mentioned before, it does provide that complete pre-cereally available protein, which I still think can be useful even if you're feeding a lot of alfalfa, because certainly I see here some of the alfalfa we feed is not super great quality. It's very stemmy, so I don't know that all that protein is really fully available.
Well, I know most of the big feed companies have a ration balancer in their lineup now.
Yeah.
And when you look at the guarantees, most are very similar nutritionally.
Yeah.
I know that they're not both the same because remember when I moved here and I couldn't get the one and I tried the other one and then my horse's black turned orange.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, how do you determine, you specifically,
like me,
like which one you're going to recommend? Like when you're talking to clients, how do you pick one?
That's a really good point, right? Because they're all 30% protein, most of them, right? And most of them are, similar zinc, similar copper, right? So yeah, you're exactly right. Like how do you, and to your point, they look very similar numbers wise, and yet you feed them and they look completely, the horse can look very different. So there's clearly something different about them, right?
Right.
So for me, how do I make a choice between two different ones? I mean, often I start out by asking the client what's easily available to them, right? Because there's no point in me recommending something that they're going to have to drive 100 miles to go get. I mean, I know myself, like I don't even want to drive 10 miles to go buy a bag of balancer that feels out of the way.
Okay, we're just going to say this and it can just stay in here. So since you guys can't see us or see what's going on, there is a landscaper outside of Claire's window, even though the window is closed, that keeps turning his leaf blower on. We keep hitting pause and restarting, and every time Claire starts talking, this guy, it's like he knows. He just keeps starting his leaf blower. Anyway, so I guess everybody just disregard the noise in the background.
If you can hear a leaf blower, you're not going crazy. There actually is a leaf blower.
And we just can't keep stopping and starting this and laughing every time. So just keep going on about it and with the leaf blower.
Yeah. So I think I was saying I start off by what's actually available to my client, because I know I'm not, oh my God, I think he stopped. Peace. I'm not willing to travel, out of my way to go buy feed. So I don't think it's not fair to expect my clients to do the same thing. So, but assuming that that's not a constraint, beyond the numbers, I start looking at the ingredient list, right? And seeing, where are the nutrients that are in the guarantee? Where are they coming from? Like, what are the sources of, like I said before, calcium? Is the calcium coming? Where's it coming from? Calcium carbonate, something else, right? Are the trace minerals, are they what we call chelated or complex trace minerals? Because I do think that there is some good scientific evidence to support the efficacy of them being more available to the horse than the inorganic sources, like the sulfate and oxide versions. But that's only for the trace minerals. I'm not overly concerned about the macro minerals being chelated, because they have quite a good absorption level even in their sort of natural oxide form, in their inorganic form. So I don't worry about those being chelated. But I do like to see the trace minerals being chelated, and I like to see selenium yeast. Either in combination with sodium selenite or just selenium yeast, again, because it's better absorbed. And then I quite like to see some, researched, in sort of capital letters, gut support ingredients. So I'm not overly excited by a lot of the probiotics. Again, if they're not guaranteed, they're often not in there at a level to be beneficial. And even when they are guaranteed, they're often not in there at a level to be beneficial. But if they are at good levels, if they're forms that have been research proven to work in horses, I do like to see, those in there as well. So that's kind of how I start picking. I get picky about ingredient sources.
Do you want to talk about what chelated minerals are?
Sure. So a chelated mineral is a mineral that's attached to some kind of organic compound, right? And when I say organic compound, I don't mean organic, USDA organic certified food that you get in the grocery store. Yeah, I mean organic, meaning that it's bound to an organic compound, something that has carbon in it, right? So it might be a protein, it might be an amino acid. So you might see on the label copper proteinate or copper amino acid complex, or you might see zinc methionine. Those are all forms of complex or chelated trace minerals. And because of how they're bound to these other compounds, they have different routes out the digestive tract, or multiple routes, not just the route they would typically be absorbed, but they may have additional routes available to them to get out of the digestive tract. So you have increased absorption versus like the inorganic trace minerals. So I do like to see chelated or complex trace minerals on an ingredient list. The trick is that often they're on there, but they're in the feed in such tiny amounts, they may not actually be in there at a level that's really going to be beneficial. So that can be tricky even for me, because I don't necessarily, oftentimes a label will have zinc sulfate and it might have zinc proteinate, but what's guaranteed in the table, it just says zinc, and I have no way of knowing how much of that zinc is in the chelated proteinate form versus a sulfate form. It's very unusual that a feed manufacturer would only have the chelated form in there, because they are substantially more expensive. So normally it's some sulfate, some chelate. And more often than not, it's more sulfate than chelate. And so then the question is well, is there enough of the chelate in there to really do anything? Or is it just tag dressing to make me feel better about the fact that, there's this more absorbable form in there, but it's not really going to make a difference to the animal? And that's tricky even for me to figure out sometimes.
So in other episodes where we've talked about ration balancers, people are feeding a fortified feed, but they're not feeding it properly. They're not feeding it to the like what the instructions say on the bag. Can you explain that scenario, how those two, where you're going to fill in with the ration balancer in that situation?
Yeah, so fortified feeds are designed to be fed at a specific feeding rate, right? Whether that's a ration balancer or a performance feed or a senior feed, right? They all have specific feeding directions that are based on things like the horse's body weight, their work level, their age, etc., right? So these instructions are printed on the bag, and when you feed in accordance with those instructions, if the feed is well formulated, it's going to ensure that the horse's daily nutritional needs are met and that the diet is well balanced. However, often owners are not following these guidelines accurately. Maybe they start out following the guidelines when they first buy the feed, but over time they morph up or down based on, how their horse's body weight is doing. Maybe they get a batch of hay, right? That's a really good quality hay, and they notice their horses put weight on, and so now they start feeding less of the performance feed because they don't want their horse getting fat, and suddenly they're now no longer following the feeding directions, and they haven't read the feeding directions in 3 years. They didn't even realize they're not following them anymore, right? Because, we all feed by feel, as we should. Like, we feed to the horse's condition, which is correct horsemanship. But you can sometimes end up straying from those feeding directions and then not having in there what the horse actually needs. So oftentimes, I think many people, including myself at times, have been guilty of, one scoop of something, right? That's a minimum of a 6-pound serving size. And maybe your scoop is 3 pounds. And so the horse might be looking great. It might be doing its job well. If it's showing, it might be winning. But you're going to be missing key nutrients because the feed isn't being fed at the correct level to ensure that all of its nutrient needs are being met, right? Because you're not feeding 6 pounds, you're feeding 3 pounds. So in this scenario, you could add some ration balancer to sort of top up the difference, right? So you might be feeding 3 pounds of that performance feed and then adding 3/4 pound of balancer on top to fill in the gaps that you've got because you're not feeding that other feed correctly. So the way I explain it to clients is that if your horse is doing great condition-wise, just eating their pasture or hay, you got that round bale out in the field, the horse is standing there eating all day, they're in great condition, great weight, they look super, then you just need to feed the full dose of ration balancer to give them that quality protein and all the vitamins and minerals that they need. If your horse needs more calories because they're not maintaining their weight on just their forage alone, but they don't need so many calories that, like, feeding 6 pounds, you'd be like, oh, if I feed 6 pounds, he's going to get fat, or he can be whatever, right? Then you're going to need to add some amount of ration balancer in there to kind of make up the difference. And then if you find that your horse actually can be fed 6 pounds without becoming overweight, then you won't need any ration balancer because you're feeding that performance or senior feed correctly.
So basically, you're offsetting the balancer and the senior feed or your performance feed against each other.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually do that with my own horse, Dartmouth, right? So he gets a pound of balancer. He probably should get like a pound and a half for his size, but he gets 2 pounds of senior as well. So I kind of do that with him.
So ration balancers are so common now, like unlike 10 years ago where, I mean, maybe they were around, I don't even know. It seems like they're fairly new. But if you walk into a feed store and you ask for a ration balancer, the person behind the desk will know what you're talking about. And they'll probably be able to even show you like 2 or 3 different ration balancing feeds that they have in stock.
Mm-hmm.
However, they probably aren't going to think of ration balancing supplements that they might have. And to be honest, like in my experience, there aren't very many ration balancing supplements that are actually sold in stores.
No, I think that's true. I'm trying to think about whether I've seen any. There used to be one that I would see in feed stores quite commonly, but I haven't seen that one for a while, and I think they may have actually discontinued it. But generally, the ration balancing supplements are more commonly purchased online.
Yeah. And I know we don't typically like to name names, and we don't talk about feed brands or supplement brands on our show. But I also know we're going to get a bunch of listeners reaching out asking about the ration balancing supplements. So
head them off at the pass, right?
I think it's just important in this that we're going to have to say some names. We are not supported by them. We're not backing them. We're just discussing them because they come up a lot and we're going to get asked the question. So let's just go ahead and talk about them for a minute.
Okie doke. Well, the ones that listeners may have heard of because they come up over and over again on the online groups are California Trace and Vermont Blend. Right. So these were developed. I mean, California Trace was coming on the market when I started doing this 15 plus years ago. So it's probably been around about 15 years, maybe slightly longer, but I was certainly aware of it when I first started. And so it's been around a while. And I think Vermont Blend's been around about a similar length of time. And they were developed around forages that are typically fed to horses in those regions. Right. So back at that point in time, there was this sort of trend for regionally appropriate ration balances. The thinking being that the mineral content of forages depends on the mineral content of the soils those forages are grown in. And that this is obviously going to vary across the country as soils vary across the country. So as a result, we got a bunch of these regional supplements, like there's Arizona Copper Complete, and there's all sorts of them out there. There's like a Texas one. There's quite, I can think of several, right? So these days, people are feeding these supplements to horses all over the country, right, regardless of location, and that's because in reality, while there are regional patterns in forage mineral content, for the most part, they're more alike than they are different, right? So people successfully feed these products regardless of where they live. So I have seen California Trace on store shelves when I lived in California, but generally both of these I think are purchased online. I'm sure people will reach out and say I'm wrong, but I don't see them on the shelf. I certainly don't see them on the shelf here, for example, in Arizona. They might be in their local regions on shelf, but California Trace guarantees like protein, lysine, methionine, threonine, those 3 amino acids I talked about earlier, copper, zinc, iodine, and cobalt, as well as selenium, and then the vitamins A, E, and then biotin. Right. So it was actually started by a hoof care provider. And so it really was developed with hoof care in mind, which is why there's biotin in it. Vermont Blend guarantees lysine, methionine, and threonine. Again, those same 3 amino acids, copper, zinc, iodine. It has some salt in it, and then it has selenium in it and biotin as well. Additionally, it guarantees magnesium, but it doesn't guarantee vitamin A or E, right? So to my point earlier, these products will give you what's most commonly missing in forage, although I'd argue that vitamin E is very often missing in forage and it's not in the Vermont Blend. But they don't provide the full spectrum of nutrients that we know horses need, right? So that's certainly like there's no manganese on either of those products, right? So there is one that can be purchased off the shelf and online that I can think of. That's Triple Crown's Diamond Balancer, which I believe they brought to market in 2025. and it's available exclusively through Track Supply, and it has a far greater nutrient profile than the Vermont blend or the California Trace. And let's see what's in that. So in the Diamond Balancer, they are guaranteeing protein, lysine, methionine, and threonine, like those other two, but they also guarantee tryptophan and leucine. You've got fat, fiber, calcium, so they have put some calcium in there, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and chloride. So they've got a lot more macrominerals in there. Selenium, zinc, and copper, like the other two, but they are guaranteeing manganese as well. They don't have any added iron, but they do tell you what the iron is in the product. Vitamins A, D, and E, and then the B vitamins, riboflavin and thiamine, and then a whole slew of ascorbic acid, biotin. And then Triple Crown are really known for their gut health component. So they've got quite a number of direct-fed microbial bacteria in there that they guarantee as well. So it is a much more complete ration balancing supplement. And as a result, the serving size is larger, right? So Triple Crown's Diamond Balancer has an 8-ounce serving, whereas the California Trace and Vermont Blend have a 4-ounce serving. So again, back to my point, like, there's only so much space. There's no space in the California Trace and Vermont Blend to put the magnesium, to put all those trace minerals, to put the calcium, whereas there is a little bit more space in the Triple Crown balancing supplement, right? And I should mention too that the Vermont Blend and the California Trace come in a pelleted and a powdered form. The powdered form has an even smaller serving size. I want to say that the powdered forms are only 2 ounces, right? So tiny.
Yeah. And I think it's worth mentioning that there's a lot of vitamin mineral supplements out there that have a lot of different nutrient guarantees, but they would not qualify as a ration balancer because the amounts of the various minerals is too small to truly balance a ration.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And honestly, I find a lot of vitamin mineral supplements that are easily available on the shelf of your feed store don't have enough of anything in them to make a difference. Honestly, whether they're, it's easy to get conned into looking at the label and thinking, I just listed off all the tons of things in that Triple Crown product. It's easy to find a product similar to that that's got 20 things guaranteed, but it's like 2 milligrams of zinc and 3. And one of my pet peeves is that quite often those kinds of products, what they do is they'll say per 1 ounce serving, and then they'll put all the trace minerals in parts per million. Right. So the number will be really big. It might be like 700 parts per million. And as a consumer, you're like, oh my gosh, look at all the zinc that's in this 1 ounce serving. Well, parts per million means milligrams per kilogram. So if you feed a kilogram of that supplement, you will get the 700 milligrams of zinc, but you're not. You're feeding an ounce. You're feeding 28 grams. Right? So often when you do the math, you're getting, 30 milligrams of zinc or something. And the horse has a 400 milligram zinc requirement or something like that. So it's just not going to make a meaningful dent in that horse's requirement. So to your point, even though that product has a lot of vitamins and minerals in it, it's certainly not going to be a ration balancer. And I would argue that it's not really, often those products are not really of any importance at all, right? They're not contributing anything meaningful to the ration, right? So, and it's really hard for owners to figure this out because, you take the Vermont Blend, the California Trace, those can make a significant contribution to the trace mineral profile of your horse, but nowhere in the name does it say balancer either.
Right.
So I would consider those to be far more like a balancer than the one I was talking about that's, got tiny quantities, right? But they don't say they're a balancer. Right, so that leaves it up to the consumer to need to know how much of a given nutrient their horse actually needs for something to truly be a balancer, versus just a generic vitamin mineral supplement that isn't making a contribution. So it's really tricky. And it's another reason, honestly, why 9 times out of 10, I'm going to suggest that you just feed a ration balancing feed and not the supplement, because you're far less likely to make the wrong choice when selecting from that category than you are trying to find the right supplement.
For our listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com. and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at clarityequine.com.
We know that if you're like us, you're probably listening to this while driving or doing barn chores. But when your hands are free, if you'd share it with your friends on social media and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, it helps other horse lovers like you to find us.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.